down, but the price at the pump is still near record highs. If it's an issue of supply and demand, wouldn't that be reflected in the global price of oil as well? Something just doesn't add up. Some of our witnesses today have stated publicly that their focus is not on helping American families or on fueling America's economy. It's enriching their shareholders. It's that type of focus that led these 6 companies alone to collectively report over $75 billion in profits last year. When oil companies are honest about why they haven't increased the supply of oil, they say it's pressure from their shareholders, not government regulation, that's holding them back. And one of our witnesses today even told the media that it wouldn't matter if crude were as high as $200 a barrel. They just simply weren't going to produce more than they already planned to. But you know something? It's not just about the shareholders. The American people who we represent provide the industry with more than $30 billion a year in subsidies, while the oil and gas companies report record high profits, and while American families are forced to pay record high prices at the pump. Frankly, this committee is not going to sit back and allow this system, which forces American taxpayers to pay oil companies out of both pockets, first at the pump and then through tax breaks, to continue in its current form. The Biden administration announced last week it's taking several substantial steps to help alleviate the price that Americans are being forced to pay at the pump, including by releasing up to 1 million barrels of oil per day from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And now it's time for Congress to do whatever it can to help alleviate the pain that too many Americans are feeling at the pump. If this crisis has showed us anything, it's why we as a country must work to break our addiction to oil as quickly as possible. And it's reinforced the urgent and existential need to transition to a more sustainable energy future. For the sake of our economy, our environment, and our national security, we must work as quickly as possible to go to that clean energy future. I do want to thank the witnesses for appearing today, and I now want to invite them to be part of the solution to lower gas prices, and now. With that, I'm pleased to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair DeGette, for holding this hearing. I believe surging energy prices and their impact on American wallets is an important topic for this subcommittee, but the majority is laying the blame for the problem at the wrong feet. When President Biden points to Vladimir Putin or big oil or other scapegoats as the culprit, I'm reminded of the words of the Wizard of Oz. Pay no attention to that man standing behind the curtain. Rather than deflect blame, President Biden should consider his own culpability for higher energy prices thanks to his relentless pursuit of policies that discourage domestic energy production, driving gas prices up to levels not seen since Mr. Biden was vice president. Over the past few decades, innovative and responsible development of the American resources yielded a reliable, affordable, secure domestic energy supply. This supply drew on all the resources of our country: oil, natural gas, coal, nuclear, hydropower, and renewables. Unfortunately, today we face an entirely different landscape. Since President Biden took office, the prices of crude oil and many other energy commodities have risen to the highest level in more than a decade. As a direct result of President Biden's anti-American energy agenda, prices have rapidly risen for more than a year. On day one, the administration made clear that it would do all that it could to shut down America's energy production by canceling the Keystone XL pipeline. Later, the president imposed a moratorium on fossil energy development on federal lands and increased pressure from financial regulators to halt fossil fuel investments. And he has no plans of stopping his assault on the energy industry. Even while gas prices skyrocket and allied countries cry out for new energy sources, President Biden continues to announce new taxes and initiatives that are designed to shut down domestic production. One of the first actions of the Biden administration was a ban on new oil and gas leases on public lands or in offshore waters, signaling a desire to restrict growth of domestic energy or oil production, and did so almost immediately. The administration made it clear that federal acreage is not open for business. It is impossible to generate confidence or investment in production today when future production is clearly being blocked by this administration. President Biden's Rush to Green agenda involves a whole-of-government approach that advises multiple federal agencies to play some part in making it more difficult for oil and gas production. For example, the administration has pressured companies to halt investments in fossil fuels. There is no denying the fact that the Biden administration has promoted an increasingly complex and challenging regulatory environment for energy companies. While President Biden should have been working to encourage domestic energy production, he went to OPEC to ask for more oil. Since that failed, the administration is reportedly considering lifting sanctions so the anti-American regimes in Iran and Venezuela can increase their production. It has become painfully clear that President Biden's anti-American energy policies embolden Putin, and in my opinion, helped to invite the attack on Ukraine. The words and deeds of the White House expose a fundamental misunderstanding of the operations of an industry it seeks to dissolve. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, President Biden stressed the short-term need to increase oil and natural gas output and expedite liquefied natural gas, LNG, project development. The oil and gas industry does not operate well on short-term proposals, however. Due to the nature of the industry, companies like the ones before us today need long-term certainty. A temporary green light to produce oil from the Biden administration will not undo the damage and the layers of red tape and aggressive anti-fossil fuel policies driving gas prices to new highs. Given the interconnection of the global economy, depressing U.S. energy production also affects our trading partners. Thus, Biden's restrictions in the U.S. forced our allies to depend on Russia and other dictators to power their economies. We need to look for ways to increase our domestic production and export capacity, such as increasing our LNG exports to help our allies break free from Russia. We need energy policy that promotes energy security while also taking advantage of America's abundant, reliable, and affordable energy resources. In a time when it has never been so expensive before to live in America, we need real solutions to disperse the geopolitical shock and provide certainty to the global market. With that, I want to thank the witnesses for appearing before us today. I look forward to discussing the current barriers the oil and gas industry face and gaining your insights into suggested regulatory or legislative actions we need to take to restore American energy. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Let me thank Chairwoman DeGette. I don't think that we could have a more important hearing than the one that you're chairing today. And we're here to get answers from the big oil companies about why they're ripping off the American people. At a time of record profits, big oil is refusing to increase production to provide the American people some much-needed relief at the gas pump. Instead, they're buying back their stock at an estimated cost of about $40 billion this year. Big oil is lining their pockets with one hand and taking billions in taxpayers' subsidies with the other. Meanwhile, the American people are getting ripped off as these companies choose to keep production low so that their own profits stay high. The American people are understandably fed up with these prices, and we're here today to demand answers from big oil about when they will finally start providing the American people some relief. As oil prices rise and Americans are hurting, the 6 oil companies testifying today made more than $75 billion in profits between them last year. It's also likely these companies will make even more money this year. In fact, on Monday, Exxon announced that its first quarter profits may be more than $9 billion. That's higher than last year's first quarter profits of $8.8 billion. And all these profits while Americans are getting taken for a ride at the gas pump. Even in the face of a devastating war in Ukraine and a bipartisan agreement to ban the import of Russian oil, several of the companies testifying today told their shareholders that they would rather make money off high prices in the market than invest in additional oil production. If these companies really wanted to do something about high gas prices, they would put their profits to work by increasing supply. Right now, the oil and gas industry has more than 9,000 approved but unused drilling permits, and they should focus on using them. The problem is not a shortage of permits or land. Big oil is choosing to keep supply low, prices high, and their pockets lined with the hard-earned dollars of struggling American consumers. And the game big oil is playing is unfortunately nothing new. For decades, American consumers have been subject to the whims of global petro dictators and the oil companies that benefited from doing business with them. Foreign adversaries like Russia's Putin can make prices unpredictable and unstable, and big oil is profiteering from our continued reliance on this volatile global commodity. Now, Republicans continue to push the same old oil above all policies, ignoring that these policies have led us to greater dependence on this volatile commodity. And where has all this gotten us? The United States now produces more oil and gas than any other country in the world, but Americans are still subject to the actions of the big oil companies. And Democrats have a different plan. We're focused on actually reducing costs for American consumers at the pump. And today, we also demand, or we're also involved in enacting 21st century all of the above policies that will give consumers real options, not just a 1970s choice between oil, diesel, and gas. The best way to protect Americans from oil price spikes is to curb our dependence on oil and transition to renewable energy, which is more stable, affordable, and generated right here at home. So Democrats have worked hard to bring real energy security to the American people. We've devoted billions of dollars to the Weatherization Assistance Program to reduce energy costs for homeowners and the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program to offset rising energy costs. We've invested in electric vehicles to give consumers a choice and make high gas prices a thing of the past. And just last week, as mentioned by Chairwoman DeGette, President affordable and generated right here at home. So Democrats have worked hard to bring real energy security to the American people. We've devoted billions of dollars to the Weatherization Assistance Program to reduce energy costs for homeowners and the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program to offset rising energy costs. We've invested in electric vehicles to give consumers a choice and make high gas prices a thing of the past. And just last week, as mentioned by Chairwoman DeGette, President Biden announced an unprecedented release of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to help drive down prices for American consumers. So we've done our part, or we're doing our part, to try to produce or have more oil available on the marketplace. But now it's time for big oil to take some action to reduce the pain at the gas pump. Produce more oil. Produce more with the wells you have, the 9,000 permits that you're not using. I look forward to hearing from each of the witnesses today about how their companies can help the American people instead of lining their own pockets. And I certainly don't want to hear from any of them that that's not our responsibility. You know, we're just companies trying to make a buck. If anybody says that to me, I'm going to say that's unbelievable if that's your attitude here today. You can make a difference, whether it's more production or somehow, reducing prices, your wholesale prices. I don't want to hear that, we only do the wholesale prices. This is all done at the retail level. It's a lot of garbage. The bottom line is you set the wholesale price, and that's the biggest part of the retail price. So don't tell us that you can't do anything about it. You can do something about it, and we expect you to do that. Maybe it's a matter of patriotism. I don't know what to call it, but something must be done on your part. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mrs. Rogers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to be very clear with the American people. This hearing is a deliberate distraction. We're not convened to address the pain you've been feeling at the pump for more than a year. If that were the case, Energy Secretary Granholm would be here to discuss how we can work together to flip the switch on domestic American energy to drive down the high cost of gas prices. Today is purely political. President Biden needs cover for his war on American energy that has caused gas prices to skyrocket. First, the administration tried blaming Putin. They called it the Putin price hike. But anyone who's been filling up their tank since last January knows this is not true. The average gas price when President Biden took office was $2.38, and it climbed over $1 a gallon well before the invasion. And the American people are too smart and have not fallen for this. So the blame is shifting to the industry. This isn't a new tactic. Just last year, Energy and Commerce Democrats held a price gouging hearing to blame the increased prices Americans are facing across the board on corporate greed. another deliberate attempt to deflect from the negative effect of the Biden administration's policies and their own record spending. The American people didn't buy it then, and they're not buying it now. President Biden and the majority Democrats should accept responsibility. This is not the Putin price hike or the result of companies suddenly deciding to make money in 2022. This is the Biden price hike, and it's been a steady climb since he took office. Energy is foundational to life. When energy prices go up, so does everything else in every part of our lives. Thanks to President Biden's skyrocketing energy prices, Americans are suffering across the board for everyday expenses. Why isn't this administration reversing course? High gas prices are a feature of this administration's policies, not a bug. President Biden seems to want high gas prices for Americans to feel pain every time they fill up their tanks. Democrats have never made driving down gas prices a priority. Why? Because they want to usher in a green revolution. If you're wondering what life is going to look like under the Green New Deal, you're getting a small taste of it now. It's not reality, and it's not something that people can afford. Oil and gas are going to be needed for decades to come. Instead of accepting this reality, they continue to shut down American energy. Sadly, this should not come as a surprise. In March 2020, candidate Joe Biden said, quote, "No more subsidies for fossil fuel industry, no more drilling on federal lands, no more drilling, including offshore, no ability for the oil industry to continue to drill, period." President Biden put in place a moratorium on new drilling. In May 2020, candidate Joe Biden pledged to stop the Keystone XL pipeline. He delivered on day one. And there are countless other examples of this administration's war on domestic American energy. This radical agenda is hurting our national security. Not only will the Democrats rush to green force America to be reliant on China, it also weakens our geopolitical leadership. We must return to the pre-Biden days of energy independence. We must lead the world in energy production to help our allies and counter our adversaries. Instead of ramping up production here, President Biden has begged OPEC and Russia to drill more oil, considered lifting sanctions on the brutal Maduro regime, wants to reinstate the Iran nuclear deal, told suffering Americans to buy an electric vehicle, and depleted our strategic petroleum reserves. Republicans are focused on solutions to drive down gas prices. I'm co-leading the American Energy from Russia Act to flip the switch on American energy and unleash production. This legislation would remove barriers to LNG exports and unlock America's energy potential by requiring leasing and permitting of energy and mineral development on federal lands and waters. It would also immediately approve the Keystone XL pipeline, force the DOE secretary to have a plan to increase domestic production before allowing any more non-emergency SPR withdrawals. We must also build energy infrastructure in America, like pipelines and LNG export facilities. We need to focus on domestic mining and critical minerals production. That's how we secure our energy future, guard against foreign dictators, and bring prosperity and optimism to America. Americans need relief, and we stand ready to deliver results. I yield back. Thank you.
Chair now asks unanimous consent that the members' written opening statements will be made part of the record and without objection so ordered. I now would like to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing, who unfortunately will be appearing remotely. Mr. David Lawler, the Chairman and President, BP America, Inc., Mr. Michael Worth, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, Chevron Corporation, Mr. Richard Muncrief, President and Chief Executive Officer, Devon Energy Corporation, Mr. Darren Woods, Chief Executive Officer, ExxonMobil Corporation, and Mr. Scott Sheffield, Chief Executive Officer, Pioneer Natural Resources Company, and Ms. Gretchen Watkins, President, Shell USA, Inc., Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, Senior Fellow, Hoover Institution, Stanford University. And I do want to thank all of the witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today. All of you know the committee's holding an investigative hearing and when doing so, we have the practice of taking testimony under oath. Do any of you have objections to testifying under oath? Please state yes or no.
No. No.
Let the record reflect the witnesses have responded no. The chair then advises you that under the rules of the House and the rules of the committee, you're entitled to be accompanied by counsel. Do any of you desire to be accompanied by counsel during your testimony today? Please unmute and state for the record.
No. No, Chairwoman. No. No.
By the way, I can see all of you on our screen here, so that's good. So now I'm going to swear you in, and so if you would, please raise your right hand so that you may be sworn in. Do you swear the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please unmute and state.
I do.
Let the record reflect the witnesses have responded affirmatively, and you're now under oath and subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. And at this time, the chair will recognize each witness for 5 minutes to provide their opening statement. Before we begin, I want to make the witnesses know that there's a timer on your screen that will count down your remaining time. Mr. Lawler, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Pallone, Chairwoman DeGette, Ranking Member McMorris-Rogers, Ranking Member Griffith, and members of the committee. My name is David Lawler. I'm the Chairman and President of BP America and a resident of Denver, Colorado. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I appreciate the committee's attention to the hardships that families and businesses are feeling due to the rising cost of energy. We share these concerns. We are committed to continuing to help meet America's near-term energy needs while also continuing to transition BP to a low-carbon future. BP has a 150-year history in the United States. We employ more than 12,000 people here and maintain a larger presence in the U.S. than in any other country. Before continuing with my testimony, I want to acknowledge the crisis in Ukraine. We are witnessing an act of aggression by Russia that is having tragic humanitarian consequences for the region. Our hearts go out to the people of Ukraine and all of those impacted by this crisis. BP will continue to support those affected in Ukraine and the wider region. At the same time, we are helping ensure that the energy supply remains secure, given that Russian oil and gas is deeply integrated into Europe's energy system. The price of oil, gasoline, and other refined products are driven by international markets. Energy markets are complex and global in nature. That means that products like refined fuel reach end consumers through several different paths along the supply chain. The current volatile energy markets underscore the need to invest in reliable energy, both low carbon sources and resilient hydrocarbons. This is the heart of BP's transformation. In 2020, BP established a new purpose: reimagining energy for people and our planet. At the same time, we announced a new ambition to become a net zero company by 2050 or sooner, and to help the world get to net zero. We aim to be net zero across our operations, production, and sales by 2050 or sooner. BP also set several near-term targets and aims along our path to reach net zero by mid-century. And BP is in action toward this transformation. In 2021, we invested $2.2 billion in low-carbon energy sources, up from $750 million in 2019. Globally, over the past 2 years, our pipeline for renewables increased more than 4 times, from 6 gigawatts to 24.5 gigawatts. We plan to continue investing in low-carbon energy sources in the years ahead. By the end of the decade, we aim to invest $4 to $6 billion per year. This means roughly a third of our capital expenditures will be in low carbon energy. A large portion of these low carbon investments are being made in the United States. This includes a $1.1 billion initial investment in a partnership in Equinor's 2 wind leases located off the coasts of New York and Massachusetts. Between them, we aim to develop 4.4 gigawatts of low carbon energy. That's enough to power more than 2 million homes each year. BP aims to steadily increase our investment in low carbon energy while continuing to invest in resilient hydrocarbons here in the United States. BP's Gulf of Mexico business exemplifies this approach. In the Gulf, we're producing some of BP's highest value energy anywhere in the world. This year, BP aims to safely start up Argos, a 5th production platform that will increase our production in the region by 25%. Our U.S. onshore oil and gas operations, BPX Energy, a business that I lead, is driving down emissions while safely producing oil and gas in Texas and Louisiana. BPX plans to spend more than $1 billion to install a state-of-the-art infrastructure network that will significantly reduce emissions from our U.S. onshore operations through electrification. In uncertain times, one of BP's primary roles is to maintain the safe, secure supply of the energy on which societies depend. The importance of this role has rarely been clearer than in recent weeks. At the same time, BP will pursue our emissions targets and aims while continuing to increase our supply of energy from low carbon sources. Thank you again for this opportunity. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Worth for 5 minutes.
Chairs DeGette and Pallone, Ranking Members Griffith and McMorris-Rogers, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Mike Worth, and I'm the chairman and CEO of Chevron. We're living through a critical and unprecedented moment in history. Over the last 6 weeks, we've watched the events in Ukraine with grave and growing concern. Russia's actions have cost many lives and displaced millions of people from their homes. The senseless violence and loss of life are heartbreaking. We appreciate the efforts of leaders across the globe to find a path to end the hostilities, and we support a prompt and just diplomatic resolution. In addition to the toll on human life, the crisis has also led to a surge in commodity prices, particularly with respect to energy. It is affecting people around the world, including here in the United States. This has added to the tremendous pressures that our economy and citizens were already experiencing from a global pandemic. At Chevron, we understand the hardship that rising energy costs have posed for so many Americans, from higher prices at the pump to increased rates for natural gas, heating, and electricity. And as the global landscape continues to evolve, we're focused on doing our part to provide Americans with access to affordable, reliable, and ever cleaner energy. I also want to be very clear about where Chevron stands. We do not control the market price of crude oil or natural gas, nor of refined products like gasoline and diesel fuel. And we have no tolerance for price gouging. In his remarks last week about the release of supplies from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, President Biden stressed the critical role that companies like ours have to play in increasing domestic supply of oil and gas. At Chevron, we're committed to doing our part to contribute to this goal. We're pursuing the responsible development of oil and gas while also investing to advance a lower carbon future. We're answering the call for strong domestic energy supply by focusing on Chevron's core strategy, leveraging our strengths to deliver lower carbon energy to a growing world. Chevron has already committed to increase our capital spending this year by more than 60% compared to 2021, with approximately half of that increase going to oil and gas production and the other half to renewable fuels and lower carbon energy. This is expected to grow our production in the Permian Basin here in the United States from 600,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day last year to over 1 million barrels per day by 2025. As we make these investments, Chevron is focused on innovating to meet the energy demands of today and tomorrow. We're increasing American energy production, and we're also producing energy that is ever cleaner. That's why we've committed $10 billion between now and 2028 to lower the carbon intensity of the energy we supply. We also remain mindful that energy security is national security, and that maintaining American leadership is important for the world. We intend to continue working with Congress, the Biden administration, and the whole of government to achieve our shared goal of delivering affordable, reliable, and ever cleaner energy to American consumers. Recent events underscore the importance of our industry working collaboratively with policymakers on these critical issues. Whether it's accelerating programs for new energy exploration or streamlining the permitting process for the development of critical energy infrastructure, we believe there are a number of policy steps that could bolster American energy supply and place us on sounder footing for the future. I look forward to a continued dialogue on these important issues. I've been truly inspired by the American people to respond to today's challenges with extraordinary resilience. And I'm optimistic about all that Chevron is doing to meet the world's needs for affordable, reliable, and ever cleaner energy. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Moncrief for 5 minutes.
Chair DeGette, Pallone, Ranking Member Griffith, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the current state and importance of U.S. energy production before you today. I'm Rick Moncrief, CEO of Devon Energy. We are at a moment of crisis given Russia's unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine. Devon Energy is an independent exploration and production company headquartered in Oklahoma City. Founded in 1971, Devon employs more than 1,600 hardworking people with operations in Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Wyoming, and North Dakota. In January of 2021, we completed a merger with WPX Energy and are proudly producing more American-made oil and energy today than at any time in our 50-year company history. Devon is an upstream company. We find and produce oil, natural gas, and natural gas liquids. We do not refine or sell refined products. We invest heavily to recover these resources and then contract to sell them at prices dictated by a complex global commodity market. We do not set or have significant influence over the price of our products. Multiple factors impact the price of any global commodity, and over the past 2 years, we have seen extreme volatility. As the COVID pandemic all but shut down global economies, demand for our products decreased drastically, and the market price for crude oil plummeted. In fact, in April of 2020, crude oil futures actually went to a negative $37 a barrel. As economies began reopening, markets adjusted, and we at Devon adjusted and began increasing production again. The events in Ukraine have now added upward pressure in the markets. While we're seeing prices level off, uncertainty still continues, which creates volatility, and I don't believe we're out of the woods yet. Shifting to our operations, Devon operates on private, state, federal, and Indian leases and must follow numerous stringent permitting processes before we can begin production. One of the permits we must obtain is an APD, or an application for permit to drill. The APD only covers the drilling and completion activity that will be done on the lease itself. We also must obtain additional permits for rights-of-ways for pipelines, roads, water disposal, electricity systems, and a host of other activities that will occur off the lease. Under normal circumstances, in the Delaware Basin, our practice is to plan on getting from APD to drilling in 5 to 6 weeks if there are no infrastructure or permit issues to slow progress. Additionally, the process to drill and complete a well and bring it to full production may mean that a significant number of weeks transpire before a well reaches its full potential. Now, with the significant delays due to global supply chain constraints and quite honestly a shortage of workers, the time is substantially increased and is now closer to 6 months. Even with these challenges, Devon's net domestic oil production increased to a new record high in 2021, reaching an average of nearly 300,000 barrels of oil produced each day, making us one of the largest oil producers in the U.S. Now, to build upon this momentum in 2022, our plan is to increase the rig count from 14 that we had in 2021 to 19 today, which is where we're at, representing an investment of approximately $2 billion. This level of activity is expected to bring more than 300 new producing wells online and bolster our productive capacity. I can assure you that at Devon, we are pragmatically investing in our business for the long haul, and we have a responsibility to more than 660,000 shareholder owners to be prudent and thoughtful. As a publicly traded company, a significant component of Devon's owners consist of pensions that represent government employees, teachers, police, firefighters, and nonprofit organizations. We're also owned by many hardworking individuals through their retirement plans or brokerage accounts. Like other sectors in the market, our shareholders expect us to operate in a way that delivers a return on capital invested while providing additional value in the form of cash returns. We're focused on achieving these objectives while pursuing environmental and operational excellence, including strong targets to reduce our carbon footprint. What's required now is a thoughtful, collaborative dialogue between policymakers and the oil and gas industry. Pragmatic solutions that ensure our nation's energy security and leadership in the global marketplace must be fostered by clear and consistent regulatory policies. We know that oil and gas will remain a critical energy source for decades to come, and Devon is proud to produce it safely, responsibly, and with care for the environment and our stakeholders. Thank you again for the invitation to address the committee and further this most important discussion.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Woods for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairwoman DeGette, Ranking Member Griffith, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member McMorris-Rogers, and members of the committee. I'm Darren Woods, Chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil. I welcome the opportunity today to discuss fuel pricing with the community. But first, speaking on behalf of all of ExxonMobil, I want to emphasize that we stand with communities around the world in deploring Russia's aggression and the devastation it has inflicted on the people of Ukraine. Within days of the invasion, we started work to exit the Salchan 1 project. We've operated in Russia's Far East since 2003 and announced that we would make no new investments in Russia. Here in the United States, the impact of the invasion is also being felt. American families are paying more at the pump, increasing the cost of living that is already rising as a result of inflation. Even before the invasion of Ukraine, as the world emerged from the pandemic, we were seeing a growing imbalance in global oil and gas markets. The invasion has further demonstrated how quickly and dramatically markets can be disrupted and how that impacts the everyday lives of Americans. Many of us will recall the Arab oil embargo of the early 1970s, the long lines and rapidly rising prices. It was a disruption caused by a sudden and significant drop in supply, when around 2 million barrels of oil a day were withdrawn from the global markets. The opposite occurred during the early days of the pandemic. A sudden drop in demand sent oil prices crashing to the point where they were actually negative. Many in our industry sustained huge losses, to the point many went out of business, all cut back on their investments. This reduction in investment laid the foundation for our current market and supply challenges. Today, Russia provides roughly 10% of the oil needed to meet global demand and about 30% of Europe's natural gas demand. A loss of this volume would be much more significant than the impact of the Arab oil embargo and would represent the largest supply disruption in the history of our industry. Unfortunately, there's no quick fix, but in the near term, the answer is straightforward. If we want to reduce prices, we need to increase supply. Our industry needs to make substantial investments just to maintain constant production levels. Without investment, the volume of production declines roughly 7% per year. That's why, even during the depths of the pandemic, when oil prices collapsed and ExxonMobil lost $22 billion, we continued to invest to increase supply. That was not without risk and was often criticized. But ExxonMobil's focus on the long-term fundamentals and continued investments are today delivering more supply to Americans. In the Permian Basin in Texas and New Mexico, for example, we expect to increase production this year by 25% over 2021, which was up 25% versus 2020. Outside the United States, we're also increasing production through a number of projects, including a world-class development in Guyana. In fact, we expect our total oil production this year will be the highest in 15 years. In addition, with new technologies and innovation, we can increase supply to meet the need for reliable and affordable energy while helping society achieve its ambition for a net zero future. ExxonMobil is committed to meeting the need for energy while also developing solutions to lower emissions and address the risk of climate change. Our low carbon solutions business is advancing projects with the potential to significantly lower emissions in the hardest to decarbonize sectors of our economy. And while we do not own or operate any gas stations here in the United States, we know that today's high prices at the pump are hurting Americans. The impact of high energy costs underscores the importance of reliable and affordable energy supplies. Finally, no single company sets the price of oil or gasoline. The market establishes the price based on available supply and the demand for that supply. Continued investments in new production is the only way to achieve balanced markets and more affordable prices that bring real relief at the pump. Government has a critical role to play here. Policies need to provide certainty and improve predictability. Consistent, efficient, and effective policies will help spur further investment in U.S. oil and gas production. Access to reliable and affordable energy is essential to modern life and underpins economic and social progress around the world. ExxonMobil is proud to contribute to this progress by reliably supplying the energy the world needs, strengthening global energy security, and playing a leading role in the energy transition. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Mr. Sheffield for 5 minutes.
Chair DeGette, Ranking Member Griffith, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Rogers, and distinguished members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. Pioneer was one of the first companies in the U.S. to publicly speak out against the invasion of Ukraine. The company and its employees have pledged over $20 million for humanitarian needs. But Pioneer and other U.S. oil and gas companies are doing much more to help Ukraine protect the U.S. The oil and natural gas that we produce have proved to be a geopolitical asset for the U.S. It's also the critical offset to Russian gas in Europe. Without U.S. natural gas delivered as LNG, Europe would have even greater difficulty standing up to Russia. Pioneer is the largest producer and most active driller in the Permian Basin, which is considered the largest oil field in the U.S. Over the past decade, our company has invested $45 billion to quadruple production to over 600,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day. Pioneer is solely an upstream company. Our products are purchased by refiners and utilities. Pioneer operates exclusively on private lands, does not refine its oil and gas commodities, produce gasoline, or operate retail gas stations. Pioneer is a price taker. We do not set the sales price of our products. Prices are determined by international markets based on global supply and demand fundamentals. Over the past 10 years, growth from the U.S. shale revolution has added over 8 million barrels of oil per day and 90 BCF of natural gas per day in this country, which has provided jobs, increased energy security, reduced energy costs, and significantly reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Past shale production growth proved to be based on a destructive financial model. We overspent and overborrowed as an industry and contributed to the oil price wars of 14-15, 2019, 2020, which led to hundreds of bankruptcies. As a result, the industry's returns were dismal. We ended up at the bottom of the S&P 500 in stock performance over the last several years. This led the industry falling from 12% of the S&P 500 to less than 4%. It became abundantly clear that for the industry to survive, the model of production growth at any cost needed to change. The investment community of mutual index and pension funds, which represents the retirement funds of millions of Americans, demanded change. The new model of sustainable growth generates returns more consistent with other industry sectors in the S&P 500. Instead of the U.S. growing up to 1.5 million barrels of oil per day in some years and oversupplying the market, the long-term annual growth rate is expected to be 500 to 700,000 barrels of oil per day over the next several years in this country. Long-term, the Permian Basin is the only growing oil shale basin in this country. The drilling inventories in the other U.S. shale basins are limited. The Permian Basin is producing today at a record high of 5 million barrels of oil per day, 20 BCF natural gas per day. Based on current internal forecast, it will reach 8 million barrels of oil per day and over 35 BCF of natural gas per day around 2030. Pioneer is providing its share of long-term growth at approximately 5% per year. We expect to produce over 1 million barrels of oil equivalent per day by 2030. Why can't Pioneer and the industry grow faster? The industry not only has to spend significant capital just to offset existing production declines, but is experiencing severe cost inflation, a labor shortage due to 3 downturns in 12 years, shortages of drilling rigs, frac fleets, frac sand, steel pipe, and other equipment and materials, and the need for pipelines and LNG facilities. Given these constraints, it would take 18 to 24 months to add any meaningful incremental production. Further, the capital available to our industry is severely impaired, with equity offerings, private equity, and bank financings essentially non-existent in the industry today. We face a future oil price curve that declines by more than $25 over the next 5 years. In the face of Russia's destabilization, aggression, now is the time to come together for another bipartisan effort to protect America's energy security and to ensure that the U.S. can continue to provide global leadership. We need more oil and natural gas pipelines, LNG plants. At the same time, we need to support adding nuclear power and other sources of alternative energy that are made in America and not in China. American energy security, whether from oil and gas or alternative sources, is important to all of us. I do not want my grandchildren to be dependent upon foreign energy supplies the way our country was for most of my life. That's why I feel so strongly American-focused, all of the above strategy is needed to maintain affordable energy and energy security for the benefit of future generations of America. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Ms. Watkins for 5 minutes.
Chair DeGette, Ranking Member Griffith, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss Shell's response to the invasion of Ukraine, the global energy disruption caused by the invasion, and our efforts to address rising energy costs in the United States. I lead Shell USA, the U.S. subsidiary of Shell plc. Shell strongly condemns the unprovoked attack on Ukraine, and we have acted swiftly in response. Shell announced that it would withdraw from all Russian hydrocarbons, halt the spot purchases of Russian crude and LNG, exit our equity partnerships in Gazprom-related joint ventures, and end our involvement in the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The phased withdrawal from our downstream operations in Russia is being planned with a priority on the safety of our staff and operations, and in line with relevant legal obligations. We will continue to work with governments across the world as they assess the incredibly difficult challenges presented by responding to the war in Ukraine, while managing the effects on global energy supplies. The global energy disruption has highlighted the importance and difficulty of moving towards a future in which global economies are less dependent on fossil fuels. We believe Shell's Powering Progress strategy continues to be the right approach, and we remain committed to helping society achieve its goal of net zero emissions. At Shell, we recognize that rising energy prices as a result of building pressure on oil supply pose a significant challenge for consumers and businesses. Shell is focused on doing our part to ensure a reliable supply of energy products and mitigate the disruptions caused by efforts to move away from Russian hydrocarbons in the global marketplace. Because oil is a global commodity, Shell does not set or control the price of crude oil. Similarly, Shell does not set or control the price that consumers pay. Indeed, it would be illegal for Shell to do so because nearly all Shell-branded retail stations in the U.S. are owned by independent operators who set their own prices in the marketplace. Shell already had in progress actions that will allow us to respond to the current crisis. In the Gulf of Mexico, we recently started production from the Power Nap project at 20,000 barrels of oil a day. And just this morning, we have announced first oil at another project in the Gulf, which will provide an additional 15,000 barrels a day. We also expect to bring online new production from the Vito field by the end of this year. Shell offers 3 thoughts regarding the challenges posed by today's energy environment. First, we cannot depart from the path towards diversification and lower carbon sources. We are diversifying our own portfolio through several recent developments, including our recent acquisition of solar and energy storage provider Savion, substantial wind power investments, including our recent $390 million investment in a 50% stake in an offshore block in the New York Bight, and renewable natural gas ventures in Oregon, Idaho, and Kansas. Second, the government should continue to advance the approval of and permitting of otherwise ready oil and gas projects that would bring new supplies of oil and gas online within weeks or months. And third, the Interior Department should end its pause on federal oil and gas leasing, especially in the Gulf of Mexico, which is among the lowest greenhouse gas intensive productions in the world. Even in the current crisis, Shell is unwavering in its commitment to the energy transition. The market challenges presented by the reduction of Russian oil and gas in the global market presents an opening for policymakers to look for a realistic pathway that would blunt the disruptive effects of the ongoing crisis and accelerate the transition to a lower carbon future. Shell recognizes that recent events have led to volatile gas prices that pose challenges for consumers. To address these burdens, I view it as our obligation to continue to provide a reliable and secure energy supply for Americans and consumers around the world. From the Shell employees working offshore to produce oil, to our staff workers in refineries that have been working throughout the pandemic, to our employees planning and building new offshore wind farms, we take this obligation very seriously. Shell will continue to invest in clean energies, and we will continue to work with our customers to help them decarbonize. We are committed to helping society achieve a low carbon future. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you very much. General McMaster, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman DeGette, Ranking Member Griffith, and members of the subcommittee, it is a privilege to testify before this committee at a critical moment for our nation and the free world. I hope that my statement for the record is useful to you and the important work that this committee is undertaking to strengthen our nation and promote peace and prosperity. I believe that this committee, this Congress, and the Biden administration have an historic opportunity to overcome the interconnected economic and security challenges we face, especially those at the nexus of energy security and national security. Because we have been complacent and I think preoccupied with our own traumas and divisions, we are behind in doing so. We urgently need new policies and new legislation to catch up, strengthen our nation, and build a better future for generations of Americans to come. In my statement for the record, I argue for policies and legislation aimed at achieving the goals of, first, reducing the coercive power of authoritarian regimes over energy supplies. Second, integrating energy security and climate policies. And third, removing bureaucratic and regulatory obstacles to progress to meet burgeoning global energy needs. With the brutal and unprovoked Russian assault on Ukraine, our post-Cold War holiday from history has come to an end. As more of the horrors that the Ukrainian people are enduring become apparent, it is also clear that the United States fell behind in realizing its potential to improve global energy security and reduce Vladimir Putin's ability to wage indiscriminate warfare while constraining the world's response through dependence on Russian energy supplies. Let us be inspired by the courage and determination of the Ukrainian people who are fighting for the freedoms we too often take for granted. It is past time to work together across political parties and between the government and industry to unleash the power of American energy to weaken the authoritarian regimes and strengthen the free world. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. It's now time for members to have the opportunity to ask the panel questions. And before I begin, once again, I want to remind members to mute themselves while not speaking, and also the witnesses, even during your question time. This will prevent feedback for witnesses and listeners at home. The chair will now recognize herself for 5 minutes. Many of the witnesses today testified that demand for gasoline went down during the pandemic, and therefore supply went down dramatically as well too. And that's because the majority of the price of gas, of course, is determined by the price of crude oil. The reality is that gas prices are high because crude oil prices are high. And the reason why crude oil prices are so high is because there's less supply in the global market. Does everybody agree with that? And I'm going to go right down the list and ask you yes or no. Mr. Lawler?
Yes, there is less crude oil
Thank you.
supply.
Mr. Worth?
Madam Chair, fuel prices are impacted by a number of factors. Crude
So
oil
you
being
don't agree that crude oil prices are high because there's less supply?
Crude oil prices are high because there are concerns about potential disruptions to future supply.
Okay, I don't have time. I'm
current
sorry,
market is
Mr. Moncrief. Mr. Moncrief?
Crude oil prices are higher because we have had some.
Right, and because
supply
there's less
constraints.
supply, right? It's a supply and demand issue, isn't that correct?
There has been less supply, and there's also
Thank
concerns
you.
about even further
Mr.
erosion in
Woods?
supply.
Mr. Woods?
It's a combination of higher demand and lower supply.
Thank you. That's what I said. Mr. Sheffield?
Lower supply and higher demand.
Right. Ms. Watkins?
Generally, yes, Chairwoman.
Thank you so much. So one of the things that has confused me, as I said in my opening statement, and it's making people mad, is why are gas prices still high even after crude oil prices came down? And this is the chart. I don't know if you can see it on Zoom, but you can see how when price per barrel of oil went down, the price per gallon of gas stayed the same. I don't get that. So I want to ask you, Mr. Lawler, BP operates a number of gas stations in the U.S. and internationally. So, Mr. Lawler, can you explain? People are saying, well, we don't own the gas stations, but actually BP does. Why is there such a disconnect between the drop in cost of crude oil and the much slower drop in the price of gas at the pump?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So just as a point of clarity, BP has branded stations here in the United States of around 7,500 or so. And only about 10% of those stations do we operate.
Okay,
and
so
set prices.
so maybe you can tell me, why is there a disconnect between the drop in cost of crude oil and the fact gas prices are staying the same?
Yes, happy to do so. So as
Very
shared earlier,
briefly, I have
it is
another
a
question. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it is a very complex set of factors that impact the price of gasoline. So for example, the price of oil that's entering a refinery could have been purchased at a higher price, and therefore that price then flows through all the way to the station. It's not necessarily an instantaneous market. There's also quite a reflection of supply risk. So we talked about just a moment ago that crude oil supplies are down. That actually applies to all refined products, whether that's jet, diesel, gasoline, and that supply risk
So
is
you're
impacting
saying
local
that the price at the pump may be higher because of jet fuel prices? Is that one of the factors you're saying?
What I'm saying is that all refined products at this point carry a supply risk,
Okay.
which is part of the complex pricing equation that impacts prices at the pump.
Okay. Can any of the rest of you, in the 41 seconds I have left, tell me if you have an idea why price per barrel of oil is falling, but price at the pump is still staying just as high? Anyone else?
Congresswoman, I think President Biden did a pretty good job explaining this last week during his comments when he announced the intent to release oil from the strategic reserve. And he talked about the fact that across the supply chain, these prices flow. Oil and product prices are correlated over time. But at the retail level, the cost that a retailer has paid for fuel a week or 2 weeks prior and the cost that they may need to pay to resupply all factor into the competition and the pricing that you see at the pump. And so these things do correlate over the long term, but in the short term, they don't always move in tandem.
Except for here, they did correlate. So the president was talking about the relief he's going to give to the American taxpayers and the American citizens at the pump. The SPRO is a short-term solution to that. But the question I wanted to ask you, and which I will ask you later so you can think about it between now and then, is what concrete steps can each of your companies take right now to reduce the price at the pump for my constituents? And with that, I'm going to yield 5 minutes to Mr. Griffith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My time is short, so I would ask that you answer yes or no. Mr. Woods, is your company taking advantage of the crisis in Ukraine to keep prices artificially high in order to increase your own profits?
Absolutely not.
Mr. Worth, is your company taking advantage of the crisis in Ukraine to keep prices artificially high in order to increase your own profits?
No, we are not.
Mr. Lawler, is your company taking advantage of the crisis in Ukraine to keep prices artificially high in order to increase your own profits?
Absolutely not.
Ms. Watkins, is your company taking advantage of the crisis in Ukraine to keep prices artificially high in order to increase your own profits?
No, we are not.
And you all recall that you're under oath. Do any of you wish to change your answers? Hearing none. All right. The Biden administration's fiscal year 22 budget request listed the following as a key objective: not funding work that directly subsidizes fossil fuels, including work that lowers the cost of production, lowers the cost of consumption, or raises the revenues retained by producers of fossil fuels. Do statements like this facilitate more domestic production? Yes or no, Ms. Watkins? Yes or no?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the context within which that was stated.
This was the president's budget objectives. One of the top objectives of his budget was to not fund work that directly subsidizes fossil fuels, including work that lowers the cost of production, lowers the cost of consumption, or raises revenues retained by producers of fossil fuels. Mr. Lawler, do statements like that facilitate more domestic production? Yes or no?
Well, I'm unfamiliar with those particular comments, so I could not.
All right. So apparently everybody wants to get into the weeds and hide behind words. The president says he wants to make sure that we do not lower the cost of production. Is that going to make you produce more or less? Mr. Woods, more or less?
I think the government has a role in encouraging investment and creating a positive investment climate.
And when we create a negative climate, you produce less. Isn't that true? Yes or no?
There tends to be a chilling effect with negative words.
There you go. There you go. Mr. Worth, you want to weigh in on this and give me a real answer? Yes or no? Is that hurting the production, or does that encourage you to produce when the president says in his budget document, not funding work that directly subsidizes fossil fuels, including work that lowers the cost of production, lowers the cost of consumption? That'd be the consumers that Mrs. DeGette's been complaining about having to pay these high prices, and they don't want to lower those prices. And when you hear statements like that, do you increase production? Yes or no?
Congressman, mixed messages from the government do not encourage us to make investments with confidence in future supply.
Well, and I appreciate you don't want to get stuck with answers, but the bottom line is that's not a mixed message. That's a clearly anti-fossil fuel message from the President of the United States at a time when he claims he wants increasing production. All right. President Biden recently has begun to stress short-term need to increase oil and natural gas output and expedite LNG, liquefied natural gas project development. But in his fiscal year 23 budget request, it focuses almost entirely on transitioning away from fossil fuels. It even proposes tax hikes on oil and gas production. The proposal alleges that oil, gas, and coal tax preferences distort markets by encouraging more investment in the fossil fuel sector than would occur under a neutral system. The provision also alleges that this market distortion is detrimental to long-term energy security and is inconsistent with the administration's policy of supporting a clean energy economy. Are those proposed tax hikes on the oil and gas industry an incentive to explore and develop more domestic production? What say you, Mr. Sheffield?
Less production.
Mr. Moncrief, more or less production?
Less production.
All right, thank you. General McMaster, in your written testimony, you talk about America's role in defeating tyranny in World War II, the U.S. provided more than 85% of the Allies' oil use. What do you see as America's trajectory today as a global leader helping to meet the rising demand for oil? And you have 5 seconds.
How about the trajectory is negative? We need to reverse it immediately. We should not be beholden to authoritarian powers for energy supply. And if we have the right investments, we can make up for the gap in supply now that we're all paying for. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman DeGette. Let me say I appreciate the executives being here today, in particular your willingness to move towards renewables. Every one of you, I believe, stressed that you are moving towards renewables, which of course is the real answer in the long run. But for now, I do want to point out, I heard Mr. Griffith say in his opening that that you all, we're dealing with the Ukraine crisis, but the reality is that during this crisis, you've had record profits and stock buybacks, and the American people want to know why they're paying such high prices at the pump and giving your industry lavish tax breaks while your profits are being turned over to shareholders. So first, I'd like to ask each of our witnesses here today to please state your net profit from last year, that's 2021, but it's a matter of public record, so if you don't tell me, I'm going to tell you quickly. So let me start with Mr. Woods. What was Exxon's net profit last year?
$23 billion after a loss of $22 billion in 2020.
Thank you. And I just saw the announcement on Monday that Exxon's profits for only the first quarter of 2022 could be as high as $9 billion. That's incredible. Mr. Lawler, what was BP's net profit last year?
It was approximately $7.6 billion after a 2020 loss of $20 billion.
All right. And Mr. Worth, Chevron's 2021 net profit?
2021 was $15.6 billion after a loss of $5.5 billion the prior year.
And Mr. Watkins, Shell's net profit, 2021?
Yes, Shell's earnings last year were about $19 billion.
Thank you, Ms. Watkins. And Mr. Moncrief, Devon's net profits in 2021?
$2.8 billion.
Thank you. Mr. Sheffield, Pioneer's net profit, 2021?
It's $2.1 billion after the largest loss in the company's history before.
Thank you. Now that's almost $77 billion in profit just from the 6 companies testifying before us today. And there's nothing wrong with making an honest profit, but as gas prices have soared, your companies have funneled record profits back to shareholders. In fact, for 2021 and 2022, the 6 companies here today have collectively executed or announced approximately $45 billion in share repurchase programs, in addition to the almost $40 billion in dividends you issued to shareholders last year. Now, that's a lot of money to shareholders, but it's coming at the expense of the American people who need you to dramatically increase production, not shareholder wealth. So it was mentioned that President Biden recently took the step of ordering a massive release from the SPRO to increase fuel supplies by up to 1 million barrels a day. But that can't go on forever, nor should it. For the American people to have relief from high gas prices, your companies need to do their part and increase production to meet demand. And some of you said you are going to do that. I heard the president of Exxon particularly say that. But what I want to know is, will you commit, and this is going to be yes or no of each of you, will you commit to doing whatever it takes, including increasing production, but also reducing dividends and buybacks in order to lower prices for struggling American consumers? Yes or no? We'll start with Mr. Woods.
We are increasing our production, as I said in our prepared remarks. The investments that we've made since 2017.
Well, I need a yes or no. So is
laid
the answer
foundation.
yes or no, Mr. Woods? Yes or no?
We will increase our production, yes.
But you're not going to, that means you're not going to reduce dividends and buybacks. Well, that's unfortunate because we need you to do that as well. Mr. Worth, yes or no?
Mr. Chairman, we're investing 60% more capital this year than we did last year.
I guess the answer is no. You're not willing to do increase production and reduce dividends and buybacks?
Mr. Chairman, we can increase production and return value to
All right,
our
I'm going to take that as a no. Mr. Lawler? Yes or no?
Yes, I can't commit. I can't commit to a reduction in buybacks and
All
dividends.
right, I hear you.
Ms.
Ms. Watkins? Ms. Watkins? Yes or
We
no?
think we can return value to our shareholders, as well as increase production, as well as invest for the future in renewables, low and no carbon fuels for our customers. We will be doing all of that.
All right, that sounds like a yes. Mr. Sheffield?
We are increasing production, and the answer is no on dividends.
All right, that's an honest answer. Mr. Moncrief?
Yes, we'll see production increases over time, and the answer is no on dividends and share purchases.
Well, I appreciate that. Now, of course, it's unfortunate that many of you are saying you're not going to address the increased buybacks and more dividends to your shareholders, because I think that should be part of what you do. But in any case, I appreciate your responses. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Mrs. Rogers for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to focus on energy security. The number one thing that we can do to lower gasoline prices is increase domestic production of oil. It's really that simple. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has done the opposite and declared war on American energy. Under President Biden's leadership, American oil production has declined by 1.5 million barrels per day. Permits for pipelines and other important energy infrastructure has been delayed or revoked outright. And the administration is pressuring banks to stop lending for fossil fuel projects. As a result, gas prices are the most expensive in U.S. history. General McMaster, can you explain why American energy is vital in the competition between the free world and authoritarian powers like Russia and China?
Thank you. It's absolutely vital, because really what Russia endeavored to do was to gain coercive power over the global economy and over Europe's economy in particular. And we all witnessed how they've used that coercive power over many, many years, not just in connection with the renewed invasion of Ukraine, which began in February. The only way to break that grip on the global economy and the coercive power over Europe's economy, Germany's economy in particular, is with alternative sources. And what's sad about it is that we have it within our power to make up for that production and to break Russia's and other authoritarian regimes' coercive power over the energy market. So this is one of the tremendous opportunity, I think, to advance the interests of the United States and the free world.
Thank you. What signal does it send to our allies when the Biden administration says no to a pipeline from Canada and yes to oil from OPEC, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela?
Well, I'll tell you, it really makes no sense at all. It doesn't pass the common sense test to cancel a Canadian pipeline and greenlight a Russian one. And then, of course, it doesn't make any sense either to put all these obstacles in place for permitting and that would allow us to increase our production and our exports, and then to supplicate to the Venezuelans and the Iranians to get them to increase their production and exports. So I think it really is past time for us to do what makes sense. And of course, this is consistent as well with the effort on climate and CO2 reductions, because our production, our transport, our export is greener. And of course, without our supplies, what's happening is the world is ramping up coal consumption and coal burning. which is the worst thing for the environment. So it's time to rationalize our policies, increase U.S. production, and increase U.S.
Thank you.
U.S. exports.
Thank you, General McMaster. I'm concerned that part of the reason gasoline prices are so high is because the Democrats ultimately are opposed to domestic drilling and hydraulic fracturing. They would rather let OPEC, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela produce the energy to meet our needs. Is it true that Russia promoted and funded anti-fracking propaganda in Europe and the United States?
Absolutely. The evidence is overwhelming. In fact, there have been hearings on this topic back in 2014 in the House that pulled the curtain back on quite a bit of it, and there's been some very good investigative journalism as well. And this is Russia's effort to portray fracking as unsafe and to do so so they can keep their coercive power over the global energy market and on Europe in particular. And of course, this is a huge missed opportunity for the world because the largest ever reduction of man-made CO2 emissions ever was associated with the availability of cheap natural gas here in the United States, which was, of course, connected to shale oil and fracking. So we're denying ourselves a tremendous opportunity from a security perspective, but also from a climate and CO2 emissions reduction perspective.
Thank you. Is it true that Russia has worked to discourage American exports and strengthen its grip on Europe's energy supplies with pipelines like Nord Stream 2?
Absolutely, and this is a story of rampant corruption. I mean, look at Gerhard Schroeder, right, the former chancellor who received huge payoffs from the Russia oil industry to begin Nord Stream 1, and then of course the continued corruption to try to co-opt politicians within Europe and within Germany to get Nord Stream 2 through. So this is a corrupt enterprise. It's Russia's oil enterprise is part of their international criminal enterprise. And we have to recognize that the best way to counter that is with alternative sources of supply, and especially North American supply. And I would include Canada in that as well.
Thank you. I really
and Mexico.
I appreciate you being here, your leadership, and your insights. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Custer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman DeGette, for hosting this important hearing today. The recent rise in gas prices has once again made it abundantly clear that our nation's dependence on oil is unsustainable, both in the short term and in the long term. The American people are reminded of this each and every time they fill up at the pump. In New Hampshire, Granite Staters are paying even more than the national average of $4.23 per gallon. And yet, while consumers are being pinched at the pump, oil companies have been raking in profits and pushing for policies that will only make our country more dependent upon oil. It's long past time we promote long-term American energy independence through investments in clean and renewable energy production to insulate our economy and our consumers from these short-term crises. This gas price roller coaster might be great for your company's bottom lines, but it's hurting the American people's pocketbooks. To the 6 oil companies before us today, you made more than $75 billion combined in profits just last year, and it looks as though with your first quarter, you're on path for record profits again. Now, to address your comments earlier, we understand you did lose money during the pandemic. Most Americans did. Everyone had a tough 2020, including businesses and the 60,000 workers that the oil industry laid off last year. But the facts are that oil majors testifying here today still returned billions of dollars to your shareholders in 2020 at the same time that you were laying off your workforce. So please, don't use 2020 as an excuse for gouging the American people today. In fact, other than in 2020, all 4 of the oil majors testifying today made billions of dollars every year between 2017 and 2021. So one bad year does not excuse the practice of ripping off American consumers. Now, I'd like to focus in on the 4 oil majors testifying today to identify how much money your company spent in 2021 on stock buybacks and dividends, and how much your companies plan to spend during this year of record profits on the clean energy investments that several of you mentioned during your testimony. And just the numbers will do, you know that our time is short. Mr. Woods, How much money did Exxon spend on stock buybacks and dividends in 2021? And how much do you plan to spend on 2022 on low-carbon technologies?
We did not buy back any stock in 2021. Our dividends were roughly $15 billion. Half of our stock are owned by average American families. It was an important income stream for them in the depths of the pandemic and during the recovery. And
So would you be
committed
surprised
as
that
we
the
ran
public
business.
record shows $14.9 billion in stock buybacks and dividends? Would that number surprise you?
That is the $15 billion of dividends that I mentioned.
I thought you just told me you did not
No
spend
buybacks.
any.
On buybacks, we had no buybacks. We had $15 billion in
$15 billion
dividends, which goes
in dividends, and how much on low-carbon investments?
We're ramping up our low-carbon solutions business and have a commitment of $15 billion through 2025 to invest in
And how much last year
technologies
when
that
you were
reduce
paying the
emissions.
$15 in dividend, $15 billion in dividends?
I
Would the
think it's
number
important to recognize
$0.5
the dividends that
billion?
we pay are critical income to people, and during this difficult
Right, I'm
economic
just trying
times,
to
our
compare.
dividends
I
were relied
understand
on
that,
for
but
income.
15 billion in stock dividends and 2.5 billion in low-carbon investments, does that sound about right?
That sounds about right, but you recognize we are
Mr.
growing our
Worth,
low-carbon
the same
solutions
question for you
business.
on Chevron. How much in stock buybacks or dividends and how much in low-carbon investments?
Congressman, in 2021, we paid out roughly $10 billion in dividends. We bought back around $1.4 billion in stock. And this year, we expect to spend between $4 and $5 billion on low carbon energy.
Thank you, Mr. Worth. Mr. Lawler, how much did you spend in stock buybacks and dividends and how much in low-carbon investments?
Yes, Congresswoman, we spent about $4.5 billion in dividends and about $4.1 billion on buybacks. We spent several $1 billion on low carbon energy, ramping to $3 to $4 billion by 2025.
Okay,
and then we'll
Ms.
be at
Watkins
$5
at
billion.
Shell, my time is almost
2030.
up. How much in stock buybacks and dividends and how much in low-carbon investments?
In 2021, we spent about $6.3 billion on dividends and about $2.8 billion on share buybacks. And on our renewable energy, we spent about $2 to $3 billion last year, and even more on low carbon fuels and investments in low carbon fuels.
Okay, my time is up and I yield
thank the
back.
gentlelady. Mr. Burgess, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. I thank our witnesses for being here. I do wish you were here in person, but unfortunately, we don't do things that way anymore. Mr. Woods, I just have to ask you, who are the shareholders? Are any part of those shareholders retired teachers in Texas whose pension plans may invest in your stock?
Absolutely. A very large proportion of the people who own our stock look for our dividends as a source of income. One of the reasons why we walked such a fine line in 2020 during the pandemic was maintain those dividends, recognizing the important role they play in retirees and the average American family.
And I think that needs to be underscored. I suspect the same is true for almost every one of our witnesses here today. To encourage production, and my thesis is that the federal regulatory burden has increased over the last 15 months. We saw what regulatory reduction did in the previous administration and led us to a situation where really we were energy independent, we were energy dominant in the world. So on that thesis of lowering regulations and increasing the performance of the federal agencies that are supposed to provide you with the permits to drill, I'm concerned because at the federal agency level, we've got a ton of people who haven't yet returned to work. They're still working from home, and I can't help but feel that that impacts your ability to get an answer from a federal agency in a timely fashion. So for that reason, I introduced a bill that will withhold any future unallocated COVID funding from the Department of Interior until they return to work to address your permitting problems. I've also introduced a bill that would immediately restart all oil and gas leasing permitting on federal land and prohibit the president from delaying the issuance of future oil and gas leases, permits, approvals, or authorizations on federal land authorization. This administration needs to get back to work, and they need to rescind their anti-energy executive orders and ramp up production here in America. We cannot forget, in September of 2019, in an unguarded moment, then former Vice President Joe Biden promised a young voter, I guarantee you, we will end fossil fuels. So, Mr. Woods, let me ask you, the Biden administration has claimed that the oil and gas industry is sitting on more than 12 million acres of non-producing federal land with 9,000 unused but already approved permits for production. So can we go through this? Just talk to us a little bit about how you obtain a federal lease.
I would tell you today, Congressman, we have about 2,000 leases on federal lands, and all but about 1% of those are producing oil or gas.
So after you get approved for a federal lease, can you immediately start to drill?
It is a fairly complicated process that requires understanding, one, what's on the lease, developing plans to produce that, the discoveries that you have on the lease, putting gathering systems in, getting permits for that, infrastructure to move product to oil. So it is a fairly complex, interdependent system of permits and investments across from the drill well all the way to the market. It's a fairly complicated and long process, particularly with delays in the regulatory process.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And it almost seems like the administration is being disingenuous when they accuse you of not performing on these leases. It is a complex and complicated process precisely because we make it a complex and complicated process. Let me just ask you again, Mr. Woods, do you think Congress could play a role in providing greater clarification of Department of Interior's leasing and permitting procedures to avoid potential litigation?
I think increased clarity, increased certainty, increased predictability, more efficient and effective permitting processes and regulatory processes would benefit the industry significantly.
Thank you. And I've got a ton more questions I'm going to submit to all of you for the record, but Mr. McMaster, let me just ask you, we've seen now the releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in a non-emergent situation. We hear over and over again that energy security is national security. Are we putting our national security at risk with these releases from the SPR?
You know, I don't know what the extent of the risk is, but there is risk associated with it. I think it's going to be important to replenish those reserves at some point, hopefully when prices are lower. But I do think that this is obviously a short-term measure for what is really a long-term, what I would characterize as an opportunity to increase U.S. production in a way that satisfies the global market and, again, reduces the coercive power of authoritarian regimes. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony today. Thank you for your written testimony.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Rice for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And I'd just like to make note of the reference that was made before to the credibility of Russian propaganda when it comes to energy issues. I just wish that more of my colleagues could give that same credibility to Russian propaganda when it comes to impacting our elections and the future of our democracy. And hopefully more of them will go in that direction. Mr. McMaster, I would like to direct my questions to you. We've all talked about Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and how it has sent global markets into disarray, caused unspeakable tragedy for the citizens of Ukraine. Gas prices have spiked partly in response to this latest global crisis. But we have been here before during the Arab oil embargo, the Iranian Revolution, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, and on and on. So long as we remain dependent on oil to meet our huge domestic needs, countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia are going to continue to have leverage over us and our allies. We have to transition to cleaner energy here at home and away from our reliance on fossil fuels. General McMaster, could you speak to the importance of ending U.S. reliance on fossil fuels, particularly foreign oil imports, as a matter of national energy security?
Congresswoman Royce, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with all of you and to answer that question. Of course, I think it's immensely important to reduce the coercive power of hostile regimes over us in the area of fossil fuels, but also in connection with all energy sources. One of my concerns is that in our race to renewables, which we have to do with undiminished vigor, we risk actually transitioning from dependence on oil in the Middle East in the 1970s or on Russian oils we're seeing today, on supply chains that are captured by the Chinese in connection with renewables. So when we put into place a sensible energy policy, I think it involves increasing U.S. production, increasing U.S. exports, and then also making our supply chains much more resilient, especially those in connection with wind and solar and all of the upstream components and
I couldn't agree with you
minerals
more,
that go
General
into that.
McMaster. And in fact, the Department of Defense, just for example, has recognized the security implications of relying so much on petroleum and has invested heavily, as you know, in biofuels and renewables for military purposes. Can you explain why, and I say you because of your past experience, can you explain why the U.S. military has looked for ways to reduce its reliance on products derived from crude oil and increase the potential for alternative fuel sources?
Well, I think the military criteria has to always be military effectiveness. And so what's important, I think, is to ensure that, as you can see with the failed Russian offensive, that logistically you can sustain forces. And what's critical for energy, for the military, is to ensure freedom of movement and action at the end of extended and contested supply lines in austere environments. And so that should be a range of energy capabilities.
But do you agree with the
I should
Department
say
of Defense?
batteries, which of course is another vulnerable supply chain,
Yes,
Congresswoman.
but you agree with the Department of Defense going in that direction, don't you?
If it increases freedom of movement and action, it
Okay,
shouldn't
so
be
in
done.
your-
It shouldn't be done for any other purpose, I don't think, than military effectiveness.
I would agree with you, and I thank you for pointing that out. In your testimony, you talk about the need to develop our domestic manufacturing capacity for renewable energy hardware and equipment, as you were just talking about. You state that it is vital to act on the Biden administration's 100-day supply chain review report and onshore renewables manufacturing. I agree with you. And that's why I supported the bipartisan infrastructure law. And that is why President Biden invoked the Defense Production Act to encourage domestic production of battery materials. Thanks to the Biden administration, we'll also soon break ground on wind farms off the coast of Long Island, and you mentioned that before, that will power as many as 2 million homes. Can you expand on the importance of onshoring renewables manufacturing so projects like these can be built with American technology and labor?
Congresswoman, it is so important to do this because China is in a race to get a lock on these critical supply chains. Everything from the rare earths and other minerals that go into the manufacturing process, as well as the separation from ore and the refinement of those materials. We don't have the capacity anymore in the United States. The one U.S. mining company for rare earths is 10% owned by the Chinese. How can that make any sense? So we are really very far behind in securing the upstream components to renewable energy, as well as the manufacturing, as you've mentioned. And that's going to take, I think, an element of economic statecraft, some significant investment, because as I mentioned in my statement for the record, we've just been complacent for too long. And we risk, again, trading energy dependence of one form for energy dependence of a new form and doing it to the Chinese Communist Party.
General, thank you so much, and thank you to all the witnesses, and I yield.
I thank the gentlelady. Chair now recognizes Mr. McKinley for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Surely this committee recognizes that the gas prices are set at the global market and are markedly influenced by domestic regulations. So let's just take a step back. According to the Energy Information Administration, gas prices historically tend to increase dramatically under Democrat presidents imposing more regulations, and have even decreased under Republican presidents. Gas prices have actually dropped 52% under President Reagan. So since our goal was to lower gas prices at the pump for Americans, we must stop over-regulating. Listen to what the panelists have been saying to us all day today. To reduce prices, we must allow increases to production and supply. So Madam Chairman, high gas prices seem to be responding to the increased regulations that have been imposed. This administration has already been waging its own war on fossil fuels by issuing a federal leasing moratorium, slowing down the permitting process. Companies have sought 22,000 permits for drilling, but only 9,000 have been approved. They're weaponizing the Federal Reserve and the SEC, and they're canceling the Keystone Pipeline and threatening others like Line 5, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, Dakota Access Pipeline, the Mountain Valley Pipeline. No wonder the market is nervous and prices have increased. Remember, our goal is to lower gas prices at the pump for Americans. Increasing regulations will produce the opposite effect. So, Mr. McMaster, yesterday the Wall Street Journal reported that the Biden administration is seeking to increase oil imports from Canada. Really? Didn't he just cancel the permit for the Keystone Pipeline that have imported 830,000 barrels of crude oil per day from Canada? And Canada's network of pipelines are already running at full capacity. So we'll have to import by rail, which, according to analysts, is more expensive. So my question to you, Ms. McMaster, will energy prices go down if we rely on rail to transport crude oil?
Congressman, I'm not an economist. I'm a washed-up general, but I would say that I think that they would go up, of course. And what I think this is just one example of the irrationality of energy policy, and this is what I mean by the need to integrate energy policy with national security policy and with climate policy. Of course, it is much more ecologically friendly to transport that oil and gas through a pipeline rather than through rail and trucks and so forth. So this is just one of many, many examples in which energy policies and decisions run counter to what our overall goals and objectives
General,
are.
if I could ask, I've got two more quick questions to you. One is, the Atlantic Coast and the Mountain Valley pipelines if they had been completed, would that have made energy costs in America more likely to have decreased?
Yes, and also made the supply much more secure and accessible.
Okay. And then the third question, in your testimony, you said that it makes no sense to cancel the Keystone XL while greenlighting Nord Stream 2. Could you explain a little bit more on that?
Well, what happened is, we denied Canada access to our market. And of course, what's Canada going to do? They're going to have to sell oil elsewhere, maybe to China, for example, which would give China maybe more power over Canada's economy. And then, of course, we enabled the coercive power of the Kremlin over Germany, which is importing 51% of its gas and 41% of its oil from Russia. This is why the European Union will not impose a hydrocarbon embargo on Russia, even as they're committing mass murder of innocent people in Ukraine. So it was an extremely poor decision that ran counter to our national security interests. And again, this is why energy security and national security policies must be integrated and compatible with one another.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think it was an excellent panel, and I think we've got quite a bit of good information to work with. So thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Ms. Schakowsky for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The vast number of American people believe that the main reason for their increase in prices at the pump, not the only reason, but the main reason, is in fact price gouging. During World War II, Congress held war profiteers accountable, and I want to tell you that a recent poll 3 weeks ago that there is overwhelming support, 80% of Americans, for a windfall profits tax. And I want to tell you that I am planning to upgrade my COVID price gouging prevention act to make sure that it extends beyond the COVID crisis, because we cannot tolerate in any industry price gouging. I wanted to ask you, or just to mention to you, Mr. Lawler, that your global CEO, Bernard Looney, recently stated, and I quote, that BP is literally, he says, literally a cash machine when oil prices are at this level. And so I do want to ask you this, Mr. Lawler. Do you think that BP should be receiving any tax payments from the American people as long as the company is making such great profits right now? I know that you are projecting that there is going to be a big profit in the first quarter. The tax rates.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think if you look at the whole context of those comments, what we were really focused on with those comments is that at these prices, it will be very helpful for the energy transition. So as we've talked about, it is very expensive to not only bring on resilient hydrocarbons, but the massive investment that's going to be needed to effectuate the energy transition cannot be understated. And I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. So in the Gulf of Mexico, I'd mentioned in my opening statement, we're installing this platform called Argos. That costs $9 billion, and it's been in motion for years.
No, I appreciate that. I have a short time, but some of the tax breaks that you get are uniquely to help you to do oil exploration, and I don't think that taxpayers ought to continue to pay that back, especially as much as 96% of subsidies for new oil wells go toward profits when the prices are so high. I wanted to ask Mr. Wood. Reports indicate that your company, Exxon, Exxon could see a first quarter profit of about $9 billion. Do you think that it makes sense for your company to receive federal subsidies while you are seeing such high profits?
So I would put our first quarter profit in the context of a much longer time horizon, which is the time horizon we make investments over. And if you look across the industry as a whole, and our company specifically across that time horizon, the return that we generate for the capital that we have to invest is fairly average versus the rest of industry. We have the cycle highs and the cycle lows, and it's important to look across those. As I mentioned, in 2020, our company lost $22 billion. And so we rode through that, continuing to make investments. In that year, we lost $22 billion. We made $20 billion of capital investments to make sure that the supply was
If I could just,
online.
because I have such a short time, you know, lots of companies, especially during the pandemic, lost money. But we do, as American taxpayers, pay subsidies to the oil and gas industry. And in some cases, the kinds of tax breaks that really are not available to other corporations. Do you think that you should be treated separately and get the kind of tax breaks that you're getting now, even when the profits are high?
I think, and what we advocate for is a level playing field. We're a global industry, a global business that competes globally, and having a tax regime that is competitive with international competitors is important. But a level playing field is our approach and what we advocate for. Don't look for special carve-outs, level playing field.
Okay, but you get special carve-outs, and I'll yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Long for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I have a question for the chairwoman. I know the other day we had witnesses here at the table for another hearing in here, and then one of my colleagues said that we don't do things that way anymore. Were the witnesses invited today or told to stay away?
So
was that their decision to not be here, or was that our decision?
In fact, Mr. Long, I encouraged the witnesses to come in person. I wanted them here in person. The witnesses opted themselves to testify remotely. That was their decision.
Was that a group? I mean, each one of them decided individually not to be here?
That is my understanding. I wanted them here at the table.
Okay, if any of you disagree with that, let me know, but I would.
Well, you know what? You can ask the witnesses.
That's what I am. I'm trying to. Yeah,
Ask
I'm
them.
sorry. Yeah, but if any of you
would,
want
because
to
I wish they would have been
chime in
right
on
here.
that, why you are not here, because, you know, I always like to look people in the eye, and it's kind of tough to do it through a computer. or screen or whatever we call that thing up there on the wall. So, but anyway, Mr. Sheffield, am I given to understand that the oil markets move in anticipation of future events, not events today, but anticipation of future events?
Yeah, it's all based on the world supply, demand, and also predictions of what may happen in the future. That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Because I remember very well that President Biden campaigned on the fact that he was going to pretty much decimate energy production in this country. And this committee right here that we're in today, Energy and Commerce, a few years ago I was on the Energy Subcommittee, and we worked long and hard to get LNG to where we could export LNG. We had to change the law to be able to do that, and we did that very successfully for a while. So it goes back to the old saying, who are you kidding when you're kidding yourself? When you're sitting here talking about price gouging and things like that, and we have a president of the United States that campaigned on the fact that he was going to do everything he could to decimate energy production in this country. I'm from Missouri. You got to show me. And this hearing today doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Mr. Sheffield, I'll go with another question for you. I'm mindful of the impact that higher gas prices have on Americans. Policies that hinder growth in the energy industry certainly impact prices. Americans pay for that energy to run everything. Small businesses heat their homes, fill their gas tanks, and it means less money to pay for groceries and other essentials, which, oh, by the way, are up quite a bit. Tires are up 30 to 40% if you need a set of tires today. Under the Biden administration, inflation has hit the highest point in 40 years. Unfortunately, experts suggest it's only going to get worse no matter how much President Biden tries to pass the blame. A key component of the Consumer Price Index is gas prices, which have been rising since day one of the Biden administration. And actually, that's not true. They started rising on November 3rd or 4th, the day, I think November 3 was the day he got elected, and in anticipation, like I mentioned earlier, of future events, knowing he was going to be president, knowing he'd campaign on killing energy production in this country, they went up the next day, and the next week they were up like, if I remember right, like 20% on crude. A key component of the Consumer Price Index is gas prices, which have risen since day one of the Biden administration. Like I said, I read that twice in case you didn't get it the first time. Oil is priced on future markets, and future for American oil and gas development doesn't look so bright under the Biden energy agenda. Can you elaborate on how inflation affects your industry, Mr. Sheffield?
Yes, we are seeing severe inflation, primarily due to the pandemic. We're seeing severe supply constraints, and that I testified already in my testimony that we're lacking a lot of equipment. The reasons why we can't grow faster is we're lacking rigs, we're lacking frac fleets. When you go through 3 downturns, we can't bring people back to the Permian Basin. Who wants to come back and work in the oil and gas industry? We just can't get people back. So we are seeing severe inflation. It's up significantly, and we'll continue to see severe inflation over the next several years.
Okay, and I got a quick question for General McMaster. What steps should we be taking to increase energy production here in the United States to lower energy costs and make us once again energy independent as we were on January 20th until 11:59 in the morning of 2021?
I think streamlining the permitting process and removing bureaucratic obstacles. I think that is the #1 impediment. And I'd like to hear from the other members, I think, who could speak more authoritatively about this, but I am aware of a number of actions, for example, that are just sitting at the Department of Energy with all of the environmental impact work done and are just waiting signatures. So I think it's important to remove rather than put more obstacles in place, which has been a tendency to be able to tap into the tremendous power associated with American energy.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all for not being here today. I think that's what I mean. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Long, just for your information, in the interim, I checked with staff, and in fact, all of the witnesses for today were invited to appear in person, but they all opted. It was their decision not to come in person today.
Thank you for inviting them, and I'm very, very sorry they made that decision.
I am too. Mr. Tonko, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before you start, my clerk, I just want to correct something that my friend and colleague, Ranking Member Rogers, said. Here are the facts. According to the Nonpartisan Energy Information Administration, domestic oil production was only 9.8 million barrels per day during President Biden's first full month in office. Since then, production has grown to 11.4 million barrels per day. That means oil production has gone up almost 2 million barrels per day since President Biden took office. So it is patently false to say that oil production has decreased under President Biden. The oil industry has a notorious track record of investing in countries run by petrodictators, including Russia. According to recent reporting, Shell, Exxon, and BP are among 9 American and European companies that have paid more than $15.8 billion in taxes and fees to Russia after it annexed Crimea in 2014. Those projects have helped to fund Putin's war chest and provide Russia with the operational and technical energy expertise that gives it leverage on the global stage. All the while, we watch in horror as the media alerts us to the tragedies in Ukraine. Each of you has since announced either pause on or exits from your Russian businesses. Mr. Woods, Exxon recently announced that it would begin the process of exiting its Salchan-1 venture in Russia and would not make further investments in Russia. Briefly, can you explain when Exxon will be completely divested from Russia?
We're working through that process now. It's rather complex because we are the operator of offshore rigs in deep water and environmentally sensitive areas. So we're working our way through that as expeditiously as possible.
Thank you. Mr. Woods, Exxon's former CEO, Lee Raymond, famously said that he doesn't make decisions based on what's good for the United States. Another Exxon CEO and President Trump's first Secretary of State received the Order of Friendship Award from Putin after Russia had already invaded Georgia. Do you agree that Exxon should not make decisions based on what is in the best interest of the United States? And what actions is Exxon taking to ensure that it no longer invests in governments run by violent adversaries of global peace?
Well, we're a company that operates on a global scale across the world. And obviously making decisions about where we choose to operate, a number of factors are inputted into that, including the administration's view and recommendation.
Is it for the best interest of the United States? That's not what I asked.
I would tell you in our business in Russia, for both Democratic and Republican administrations have encouraged our investments there as a way to bring Western values into Russia and benefit the Russian people.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Mr. Wirth, I listened as you committed to, and I quote you, maintaining American leadership. But Chevron's website indicates that it has marketing and retail operations in Russia and that it supplies Russian oil companies with lubricants and other materials. According to your website, Chevron is merely pausing all transactions in Russia. Question, will you make a commitment that Chevron will not simply suspend but terminate all operations in Russia and that it will no longer supply Russian oil companies with the lubricants and materials that help Russia fill its coffers? Yes or no?
Congressman, we've halted all those sales, and for the foreseeable future, there's no way that those will resume.
Mr. Watkins, I would like to take the opportunity, or Ms. Watkins, excuse me, I would like to take the opportunity to share how shocked I was by Shell's decision to purchase new Russian oil cargoes. I think it justifies the concerns of many who believe that the major oil companies will always prioritize their own profits, even when basic moral values are at stake. Having said that, I'm glad that Shell, too, has now decided to exit its operations in Russia, and it's withdrawing from purchases of Russian petroleum products. Briefly, can you explain when Shell will be completely divested from Russia?
We're in the process of working through that. We have ceased buying all spot crude and all spot LNG at this point in time. We have walked away from our investments that we have with Gazprom. We are in the process of figuring out how to do that. It is not completely clear. We need to be in compliance with all laws and sanctions, and we are doing it as fast as we possibly can.
And Mr. Lawler, BP has also recently announced that it is exiting its 19.75% stake in Rosneft, an oligarch-run operation that helps Putin project power in Europe. Since Russia's invasion of Crimea, reporting indicates that BP has paid approximately $817 million in taxes to the Kremlin, in addition to $353 billion in taxes, fees, royalties, and profits remitted to the Kremlin by Rosneft itself. What specific actions is BP taking to exit its Russian operations, and when will BP be completely divested from Russia?
No, thank you for the question. What I can say is that BP was horrified with the military action and the war against Ukraine. Within 96 hours, we announced our intention to exit our position with Rosneft in Russia. That means up to a $25 billion write-down. So the company's actually quite serious about our response. And what I would say is that we're looking at all options. It's still early, but we will come back and report when that process is complete.
I would hope
and we're looking at it.
I hope it would be done with great urgency. It's troubling that you place profits over people and profits over our planet. With that, I yield back.
I thank the
did
gentleman.
write down
I thank the
$25 billion.
gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Palmer, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman, and I thank the witnesses for being willing to be here today, considering all that you've been through and all that my Democrat colleagues have put you through over the last few months. And I appreciate the fact that there are multiple factors that impact the price of oil and gas, natural gas, and the most fundamental, obviously, is supply versus demand. But obviously, when demand is high and supply is limited, prices go up. But that's not the only consideration when it comes to oil and natural gas. Uncertainty created by government policies that impact investment decisions and the availability of capital also impact prices. Would all of you agree with that? And I'd appreciate if all of you answered at once, yes or no.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
What is happening here today and what happened last fall when your companies were attacked by my Democrat colleagues on the Oversight Committee will continue to impact oil and gas industry decisions and prices because it creates more uncertainty in terms of capital investment. The hearing before the Oversight Committee last fall attacked your companies. Now this is what gets me, is here we are attacking you because price is high because supply is low, and they opened up the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to increase supply, but they attacked you last fall for producing too much oil, and one Democrat even used jars of M&Ms and bags of rice to illustrate the point. Another Democrat on the committee called one of you a liar and compared your industry to tobacco companies. There was another Democrat that said that they want to have big oil hearings like they had big tobacco hearings. I kind of think that's what we're doing today, setting this all up. It was part of a strategy that was developed at a meeting in La Jolla, California in 2012, where left-wing activists mapped out a strategy to take down the fossil fuel industry. Are you aware that your industry is being set up? Are you aware that these hearings are likely part of a strategy to destroy public confidence in your industry that was laid out, like I said, in 2012, where these activists mapped out this strategy? The American people should be aware of what is taking place here because it's going to impact them enormously. I think you should trust the judgment of the American people more than you do the judgment of the Biden administration or my Democrat colleagues in terms of their choices for providing energy for their homes, and choices and their decisions on the transportation that they decide they want to utilize in the conduct of your business and base it on that. Now, I realize that it's going to be very difficult for you to do that as long as the Biden administration and the Democrats in Congress work to undermine the domestic energy production. But it's not just the price of energy that should be of concern to every one of us and to every American. It's also a national security issue. By shutting down our domestic energy production, not only have we made Europe, all of Europe, more vulnerable to the influence of Russia, we've undermined our own national security, and I'd like General McMaster for you to comment on that.
Well, I think as we've said, Congressman, the energy security is national security. We can see that just quite dramatically with the invasion of Ukraine, but that's always been the case. And I do think that there have been constraints put on our ability to take full advantage of the great the resources we have in this country to not only satisfy the global market in a way that's cleaner, but also in a way that breaks the grip of these authoritarian regimes. And I would like to see maybe now put into place an energy policy that is connected to our national security strategy. And I think it's past time to do that, Congressman. Thank you.
I appreciate that. One of my colleagues pointed out that in previous administrations, we've seen substantial price impacts. I hearken back to the last time we saw price increases like this, maybe to the presidency of Jimmy Carter, when the price of gasoline almost doubled by the end of his administration. God help us if that happens in this administration. I just want to point out again to the American people, I hope that are paying attention to this, the inconsistency and the hypocrisy of these hearings. What's happening here today is going to impact every American family. It's going to impact jobs, not only in your industry, but other jobs. And it is going to undermine the prosperity and economic future of this country. Madam Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now I'm pleased to recognize Mr. Ruiz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, for holding this hearing on a critical issue on the top of my mind and my constituents' mind. In my district last week, I saw prices between $5.49 and $6.40 a gallon. These prices are outrageous, and my constituents are struggling at the pump and struggling to make ends meet. I hear from constituents who tell me how the outrageous gas prices are putting everything out of reach. They tell me that they're struggling to afford the gas just to go to work. I'm curious, on your salaries, do any of you have trouble affording the gas to get to your job? I didn't think so. And as this graph behind me, based on research, shows, while American families are struggling with high gas prices, you and your big oil corporations are making record profits choosing to keep supply low instead of investing oil in production. In the 9,000 unused permits, you choose to make more profits for shareholders. During this Russian war, you are ripping the American people off, and it must end. Gas prices need to go down. And while the rest of America is trying to make this happen, you all are trying to increase your record profits. And gas prices cannot continue to be dependent on the whims of autocrats like Putin, who can weaponize oil against us. The solution for now and in the future is transitioning to a clean energy future where we aren't dependent on oil. We must expand our use of affordable electric vehicles with batteries that are made in America with American materials. Right now, we're sitting on the 5th largest lithium deposit in the world, big enough to power our clean energy future and meet our battery manufacturing needs right here at home in Southern California, in my district, underneath the Salton Sea. What's unique is that this lithium is extracted from the brine from geothermal energy production. A clean energy future will break us free from our dependence on oil. It'll ensure we won't have to worry about outrageous gas prices like we're seeing now, and if we do it right, it'll create sustainable manufacturing here at home. So I'd like to hear from the companies here today, what are you doing to move us toward that clean energy future? Mr. Lawler, can you briefly discuss what BP is doing to move us toward a clean energy future with more electric vehicles?
Absolutely, Congressman. Thank you for the question. So I might start by saying I grew up in Denver, Colorado in the 1970s. And my dad printed the Denver Post each night and was a member of the union. And I remember clearly as a child the pain that the cost of gasoline imposed on our family. And
so what are you doing to honor that memory and moving towards the clean energy future?
Well, no, I appreciate that opportunity. So what we're doing at BP is we're working flat out. Our refineries are running flat out. We are bringing 140,000 barrels of crude oil to the market this year, in the second half of this year. We've also
That doesn't sound too clean to me. What are you doing to expand the clean energy future with batteries, electric vehicles, something that will help clean our air and help us not be dependent on oil?
No, absolutely. So again, we're making the transition investments that are needed. As I mentioned, we're going to install 4.5 gigawatts of power offshore Massachusetts and New York. We'll be rapidly expanding the number of EV charging stations in the states. We do have a 50-50 partnership with LightSource BP that's putting in numerous large solar farms across the United States. in many, many places. And we just bought a company called 7X, and we'll be installing a significant number of solar fields in the mid-continent region of the United States. And we will be spending $5 billion a year by the end of the decade. So BP is in action. We have real things that are happening now.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I want to ask Ms. Watkins the same question. What investments is Shell making to develop and improve on lithium battery and electric vehicle technology to transition us to a cleaner future?
Yes, Shell's making a lot of investments to advance to a cleaner future. In fact, our whole strategy is premised on working very closely with our customers in order to increase the demand for low and no carbon fuels, including electric vehicles. As you mentioned, we have a company within our company called Green Lots that actually is working to install electric vehicle charging and back office software systems. We're working with cities